How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Zayin, Daf 7 of Masechta Zevachim. Gewaldig. Look, Daf 7 of Masechta Zevachim is Gewaldig. Honestly, every single Daf of Masechta Zevachim has been amazing. Long and complicated, but amazing. I think what's hard about Zevachim is that there's like so many, it almost reminds me in some ways of like Yevamis, where like there's like just so much set up for every scenario, you know? So today's talk, going to have a bunch of kind of like figuring out the scenarios, at least the first part of today's talk. The first part of today's talk is Shinui kodesh and Shinui baylim scenarios. Yeah, honestly, just like, yeah. Honestly, in some ways it kind of feels like Yevamasi in that sense, right? If you remember Yevamis, that was something else. As I think I mentioned recently that like as time goes on, I think I forget how... Scar isn't like a nice or correct word, but like that was yeah. I think my relationship with Yevamis is improving as time goes on. But anyways, in Yevamis there was a lot of like setting up the scenario, setting up the scene. There isn't so much setting up the scene here as much as like figuring out exactly like, all right, let's like understand what we're dealing with before we can kind of try to diagnose. Is this going to be Shinui kodesh? Is it going to see Shinui baylim? Is it going to be kosher? Is it going to be puzzle? How kosher? How puzzle? Etc. Anyways, so the first, I'd say, amud or so of today's daf is going to be kind of really working through Shinui kodesh and Shinui baylim. And the second section of today's daf is going to be the source for Korbin Pesach being required to be Lishmah, right? Of course, we had two, right? In the Mishnah, we had said that any of the korbanos that are lo Lishmah, so they're kosher, but shelo alu l'vaylim b'shem chova, two exceptions, chatas and Korbin Pesach, those are completely possible. It's all right. The Lishmah is not just the mitzvah, but me'akev. It's not just the chatchila, but even b'di'evid. So today we are going to learn the source for why by Korbin Pesach it's me'akev. Lishma is me'akev. Tomorrow we are going to learn about Korbin Chatas, why it's me'akev. But today we'll learn the source for why Korbin Pesach is me'akev. Friends, let us jump in. All right, friends, we are going to begin on Daf Zayin Amid Aleph, about 10 lines in or so. At the two dots on Daf Zayin Amud Aleph Itmar, it was stated Todas shechachta l'shem Todas chaveiro. Rabbi Amar Ksher Rav Chizda Amar Psula. This is an interesting scenario, right? As we said, the first part of today's daf is Shinui kodesh and Shinui baylim scenarios. Here's the first scenario. Okie dokie. And as I said, we have to kind of set up the scene. All right, we got a Haran. A Haran is our Kohen who's going to be doing our slaughtering. Okay, now here's the thing. So Reuven is bringing a Korbin Toda. Why is he bringing a Korbin Toda? Well, if I'm not mistaken, Korbin Toda basically aligns with Birkas HaGomel, which also aligns with, is it Per Kuf Zayin of Tehillim? Right, so there are four scenarios. There's somebody gets out of prison, somebody gets out of the hospital, somebody returns from a trip at overseas, like literally overseas, and finally somebody who was in the desert, had a long trip in the desert. And so basically in these four scenarios, a person survives and they say Birkas HaGomel nowadays, when there is the Beis HaMikdash, and hopefully very, very soon, we will bring a Korbin Toda. So now, Reuven had to bring a Korbin Toda. Why did Reuven have to bring a Korbin Toda? Let's say he got out of the hospital. He was very sick. He was in the hospital. He got out of the hospital, and now he's bringing a Korbin Toda. Now, here's the thing. Shimon is also bringing a Korbin Toda. Why is Shimon bringing a Korbin Toda? He got out of jail. Okay, Reuven got out of the hospital, Shimon got out of jail. They're both bringing a Korbin Toda. Now, Aharon is slaughtering Reuven's Korbin Toda for him. So Reuven brings his animal, and Aharon is slaughtering Reuven's Korbin for him, and Aharon's intention is, hi Reuven, I'm slaughtering your Korbin Toda for you. Meaning, Aharon's intention was to slaughter a Korbin Toda, not to slaughter any other Korbin. So it was Lishmah in that sense. His intention was also for Reuven. So it was also the Shem baylim in that sense. Okay, so what's the question here? The question is that when Aharon slaughtered Reuven's Korbin Toda as a Korbin Toda for Reuven, he had the intention of Shimon's Korbin Toda, meaning a Korbin Toda could be brought for one of four reasons that we mentioned a minute ago. Reuven was bringing his Korbin Toda because he got out of the hospital. For whatever reason, Aharon slaughtered Reuven's Korbin Toda for Reuven, but not as a Korbin Toda being brought for getting out of the hospital, but as a Korbin Toda being brought for getting out of prison. That's the question. So the question is this considered, it's not a question of Shinui baylim. Aharon is not slaughtering Reuven's Korbin for Shimon. No. To do Zugazam for Shimon. No, it's for Reuven. The question is, the fact that Aharon is slaughtering Reuven's Korbin Toda, which is being brought for having gotten out of a hospital, but his intention was for a Korbin Toda for having gotten out of prison, which was really what Shimon's Korbin Toda is coming for. That is our question. Is that considered, right? As we're going to see, Rabbah says it's kosher because, look, Aharon's slaughtering a Korbin Toda as a Korbin Toda. What more do you want? Whereas Rav Chizda says, yes, but the wrong Korbin Toda. I got a glass of water here, so I'm going to take advantage of that. 1 second. I feel like I should start making the bracha on camera. I mean, usually this isn't my first drink of the day, but that would be so classic. I should, during Babble on Talmud, make a bracha, and everybody says Amen. Okay. Itmar, it was stated, Toda sheshchat l'shem Toda. So Aharon slaughters Reuven's Korbin Toda as a Korbin Toda for Reuven, but whereas Reuven was bringing the Korbin Toda for having gotten out of the hospital, Aharon slaughtered Reuven's Korbin Toda for having gotten out of prison, which was actually the reason for Shimon to bring his Korbin Toda. So in my Toda sheshchat l'shem Toda schaveru, Rabba Amar Kshera. Rabba says no, it's kosher, completely kosher. Rav Chizda Amar Psula. Rav Chizda says, so when Rav Chizda says Psula, obviously it doesn't mean it's like not kosher, because that would only be chatas and Korbin Pesach. But it means that it would not be Ola lebaylim shem chova, right? If Reuven says, I'm going to bring a Korbin Toda, well, this Korbin Toda is not going to satisfy that. Yeah, I think part of why these asks have been going so slowly is because it's just like always like, we're talking about Toda, we're talking about some other Korbin, we're talking about Korbin, right? But it's not Korbin Pesach or Chatas, and Reuven is like just so many things that like have to be, we got to like be clear about and need to be clarified and spelled out. Okay, Rabba Mekshera Rav Chizda Amar Psula. Rabba Mekshera Toda l'shem Toda nishchita. Rabba says it's kshera. Like give the guy a break. Reuven brought a Korbin Toda. It was slaughtered as a Korbin Toda for Reuven. Like that's fine. What more do you want? Like, okay. Toda as a Toda, all good. Rav Chizda Amar says Rav Chizda Psula. Why? L'shum shlam didei nishchita ba'inon. We need, right? Because what does the pasuk say? The pasuk says Zevach Todas Shlamav. That's what the pasuk says by Korbin Toda. It says Uvsai Zevach Todas Shlamav. So because by Korbin Toda it says Zevach Todas Shlamav, his Shlamim, so it must be slaughtered for him, for his Shlamim. It can't be that even though Aharon is slaughtering Reuven's Korbin Toda for Reuven, but it is with the purpose of what Shimon's Korbin Toda was being brought for, that is not okay according to Rav Chisda. Nishchita ba'inan. Fine. Amar Rabba Mana Aminala. Says Rabba, how do I know that I'm right? Why am I saying what I'm saying? That at the end of the day, a Toda was slaughtered as a Toda, all good. Tisanya, as we learn in a Brisa. 1 second. Tisanya, as we learn in a Brisa. Uvsar Zevach Todas Shlamav. Pirmakrivo as Zivcho v'Gomer. Okay. So okay, we learn in the Brisa. The Pasuk says Uvsar Zevach Todas Shlamav. Okay, that's really the main thing. There's a Gozer student says you can even get rid of Biyom Akrivo as Zivcho v'Gomer. But anyways, Abachonen Omar Mishum Reb Eliezer. Ba'Lamed. Okay, when the Pasuk says Uvsar Zevach Todas Shlamav, it is coming to teach Toda Sheshchata L'Shem Shlamim Kshera. It says Todas Shlamav, the Toda of his Shlamim. Meaning, Shlamim is kind of an umbrella in some sense. Kilu, a Toda is a type of Korbin Shlamim, whereas Shlamim is not a type of Korbin Toda. Toda is a type of Shlamim, not the other way around. A Shlamim is not a Toda. Toda is a Shlamim. So Toda Sheshchata L'Shem Shlamim Kshera. So a Toda that is slaughtered as a Shlamim, that's fine, because it is a Shlamim. It's a type of Shlamim. But Shlamim Shenishchatu L'Shem Toda B'sulim. But a Korbin Shlamim slaughtered as a Korbin Toda, that a Korbin Shlamim is slaughtered with the intention of a Korbin Toda, that's already going to be not Lishmah. And it'll be Pasul, it won't be Ola Baylim Shem Chov. Of course, it'll be kosher because it's not a Chatas or a Korbin Pesach. What is the difference? Why is a Toda as a Shlamim kosher, but a Shlamim as a Toda is not? Toda Kruya Shlamim. Well, that's because a Toda is a type of Shlamim, is called a Shlamim. Ben Shlamim Kruyin Toda, but a Shlamim is not called a Toda. It's not a type of Toda. Now we said Shlamim L'Shem Toda Psula. Now we're saying that a Shlamim as a Toda is Psula, right? Is that not what we said? Right? We said besides Zevach Toda Shlamim. So what Reb Chanan says from Reb Eliezer is that a Toda slaughtered as a Shlamim, cool. Shlamim slaughtered as a Toda, uncool. But now Rabba is Medayik. Oh, what's the diuk? The diuk is as follows. Shlamim L'Shem Toda Psula. We had said that if a Shlamim is slaughtered as a Toda, that's a problem. However, what about a Toda as a Toda? A Toda L'Shem Toda Kshir. But a Toda being slaughtered as a Toda is Kshir. My love, Techaver. And Rabbah wants to say, what's the Chiddush here? The Chiddush is, even if Ruvain's Toda is slaughtered as Shimon's Toda, meaning not for Shimon, but meaning Reuven's Toda was coming because is being brought because he got out of the hospital. Shimon's Toda is being brought because he got out of prison. And Reuven's Toda was slaughtered as a Toda for Reuven, but with the intention of getting out of prison, which is the wrong type of a Toda. We want to say that that's fine, because after all we're saying is that a Shlamim as a Toda is what is problematic. But a Toda as a Toda is going to be fine, even if it's the wrong type of Toda. That's fine. It's still a Toda. Lo D-Day, to which Rav Chisda would respond and say, no. What it's saying is, a Shlamim as a Toda is a problem. Sure. But a Toda as a Toda is good, meaning, for Reuven's own Toda, if Reuven slaughters his Toda as a Toda, it is good. What does that mean? Well, instead of Reuven bringing his Korbin Toda for getting out of the hospital and Shimon bringing a Korbin Toda for getting out of prison, what if both applied to Reuven? What if Reuven's has had a very eventful recent history? He has gotten out of the hospital and also gotten out of prison. And now he's bringing two Korbin Todas, one for getting out of the hospital, one for getting out of prison. He's now bringing his Korbin Toda for getting out of the hospital. Ahar and slaughter is Reuven's Korbin Toda for Reuven. as a Korbin Toda. But with the Kavana of, but Aharon thinks that he's slaughtering the Korbin Toda that Reuven needs to bring for getting out of prison, but really this is the Korbin Toda for getting out of the hospital. So in that case, where the mistaken Toda type was another type of Toda that Reuven himself had to bring, so Rav Chizda would argue that's what the diuk is, that is kosher. So even though Aharon is slaughtering Reuven's Korbin Toda that's meant to be for getting out of the hospital, but Aharon's intention was for a Toda for getting out of prison, so Rav Chizda would say that's fine. The pasuk says a shlomim as a Toda is a problem, a Toda as a Toda is okay, meaning even though it's the wrong type of Toda, but since both Todas under consideration, both of them belong to Reuven, therefore it's okay. But Rav Chizda would say, if the prison Toda was not another Toda that Reuven has to bring, but a Toda that Shimon has to bring, Rav Chizda would say that the diuk of the pasuk would not apply that to that. That would actually be pasul. Okay. Okay, but then the Gemara says, okay, so Nusar of Chizda, you're telling me what? So you're telling me that if Reuven had to bring a Toda for getting out of the hospital, Shimon had to bring a Toda for getting out of prison, and Aharon slaughters Reuven's Korbin Toda for Reuven as a Korbin Toda, but for the purpose of Shimon's, which is to get out of, because he got out of prison. So you're telling me that that's a problem. So you're telling me that that's psula, but then the Gemara pushes against Rav Chizda and says, "Adatani shlamim l'shem toda psula." Lest they toda l'shem toda, v'chosh against shlamim l'shem toda. The Gemara then asks a great question. Who could tell us what the great question that the Gemara asks is? Well, why is the pasuk telling us about a lesser chiddush? We're saying that if one slaughters a shlamim as a Toda, pasul. But friends, I have a bigger chiddush for you. If somebody slaughters a Toda as a Toda, it's pasul. That's a much bigger chiddush. When you tell me if somebody slaughters a shlamim as a Toda, it's pasul. Okay, fine, I can understand that. But tell me a bigger chiddush. Somebody who slaughters a Toda as a Toda is pasul. What? A Toda as a Toda is pasul? Yeah. If Aharon slaughters Reuven's Toda, which is meant to be for getting out of the hospital, but Aharon's intention was for getting out of prison, which was Shimon's Toda, that would actually be pasul. So tell me the bigger chiddush, that actually, if one slaughters a Toda as a Toda, it could still be pasul. Tell me that. So again, if you're going to tell me that when Reuven's Toda is slaughtered with the intention of Shimon's Toda, it's pasul, so tell me that chiddush. Don't tell me that a shlamim as a Toda is pasul. Tell me a Toda as a Toda is pasul. Now that's a much more interesting chiddush. L'shem Toda, right? Certainly, if a Toda l'shem Toda is pasul, certainly then a shlamim l'shem Toda is pasul. So answers the Gemara, shlamim l'shem Toda didei itzrich lei. No, the pasuk we did need to learn about when Reuven is bringing a Korbin shlamim, and the intention during the shechita is for a Korbin Toda. That did need to be taught, because Sagadati Chamina mide Toda kruya shlamim nami kruyin Toda v'chi shachit lehu l'shem Toda lichshiru komajmalim. So Gemara says, I still need to know the chiddush that a shlamim slaughtered as a Toda is psula, because, meaning we wanted to say that just tell me that a Toda as a Toda is pasul, right? When Reuven's Toda is slaughtered with the purpose of Shimon's Toda, right? We want to say, tell me that a Toda as a Toda is pasul. Certainly a shlamim as a Toda is pasul, not necessarily. because I may have thought to say that, well, we said that a toda slaughtered as a shlamim is kosher, so I actually may have thought to say that maybe a shlamim as a toda should also be kosher. If a toda as a shlamim is kosher, shlamim as a toda should be kosher. So therefore, we needed to say that a shlamim as a toda is possible. We needed to say a shlamim as a toda is possible. However, you know what else is also possible? A toda as a toda is also possible if we're talking about Aharon slaughtering Ruvain's Korbin Toda for the purpose of Shimon's Korbin Toda. Ruvain's Korbin Toda coming for getting out of the hospital, being slaughtered for the purpose of Shimon's Toda, which is getting out of prison. But Rav Chisda would still maintain, so Rabbi tried to bring a proof that Ruvain's Toda slaughtered for Shimon's Toda should be kosher, but Rav Chisda manages to push back and say that Ruvain's Toda slaughtered for the purpose of Shimon's Toda is going to be pasul. Omar Rove, says Rove, Chatos sheshchoto l'shem chatos keshera gevaldig. So wait, this? Yeah, okay, good. Yeah. When do we? Oh, wow. Okay, fine. Doesn't seem like we actually passed them this way. Hey, we don't have to worry about that now. It's going to come up in a few days from now. Okay. Now, where were we? Okay, Omar Rav, it says Rav, we saw this a few days ago. Chatas sheshchoto l'shem chatas kshera. L'shem ola psula. Who can tell me what this means? Well, what this means is that honestly similar to the previous scenario, right? The previous scenario was Ruvain's Toda was slaughtered as a Toda, just a different kind of Toda. So here also, says Rava that a Korbin Chatas that is being brought for Chelev, that was slaughtered as a Chatas that's being brought for a Dam. So says Rava, it's Ksher. Okay? Again, on my Rava says Rava, Chatas, a Korbin Chatas, a Chatas Chelev, Korbin Chatas being brought for having eaten Chelev, Sheshchat L'Shem Chatas, that was slaughtered for a different kind of Chatas, Chatas Dam, Ksher. L'Shem Ola Psula. But of course, if a Korbin Chatas is slaughtered as an Ola, well then of course that will be Psula. My time outcome, V'shachat Osa L'Chatas Amar Rachmana. V'arei Chatas Shem Chatas Nishchata. But the Shem Ola Psula, because the pasuk says, again, V'shachat Osa L'Chatas. The pasuk says that you have to slaughter a Korbin Chatas as a Korbin Chatas. V'arei Chatas Shem Chatas, and that's exactly what happened. A Korbin Chatas Chelev, slaughtered as a Chatas Dam, is kosher because the pasuk, all the pasuk says is V'shachat Osa L'Chatas. You have to slaughter as a Chatas. It was slaughtered as a Chatas. Okay, Zeu, Yotzizan. Whereas the Shem Ola Psula, if a Chatas is slaughtered as an Ola, okay, that's going to be that is Psula. Chatas cannot be slaughtered as an Ola. Okay. Rava says Rava, Chatas sheshchata al mi shemechuyev chatas Psula al mi shemechuyev Ola ksher. We also saw this as well. This is talking about Shinui baylim now. Right? Mi shemechuyev chatas shenishchat mi shemechuyev chatas Psula. If Aharon slaughters Ruvain's, so okay, Ruvain needs to bring a Korbin Chatas, he ate Chelev, whatever. Shimon needs to bring a Korbin Chatas, I don't know, he also ate Chelev, it doesn't matter. Ruvain needs to bring a Korbin Chatas, Shimon needs to bring a Korbin Chatas. Aharon slaughters Ruvain's Korbin Chatas with the intention of doing Zrikas Adam for Shimon, who also needs to bring a Korbin Chatas. Psula, so that's Psula. However, if Shimon needs to bring a Korbin Ola, and Aharon slaughters Ruvain's Korbin Chatas with the intention of doing Zrikas Adam for Shimon, who needs to bring a Korbin Ola, Ksher, that's fine. That's not going to ruin anything. So again, Rava says Rava, Chatas sheshchata al mi shemechuyev chatas psula. Aharon slaughters Ruvain's Korbin Chatas with the intention of doing Zrikas Adam for Shimon, who also needs to bring a Korbin Chatas, Psula. But Amishim Chuyev Ola Ksher. But if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's Korbin Chatas with the intention of doing Zrikas Adam for Shimon, who needs to bring a Korbin Ola, kshera. My time outcome the keeper olav velo al chavero. Right? That how do we know about Shinui baylim? Right? And of course, Shinui baylim is specifically by the zrikas adam. Right? That Aharon is slaughtering Reuven's Korbin with the intention of doing zrikas adam for Shimon. So we say olav lo chaveru. The zrikas adam, right? Chiper is zrikas adam. Kapara ki adamu b'nefesh yichaper, as we saw yesterday. Right? That was yesterday. Why not? So the zrikas adam needs to be done for him, for Reuven, not for Shimon. But we say chaveru dum yedidei. Olav lo chaveru dum yedidei. That his friend needs to be like him, b'mechuyev kapara kamoso, i.e., his friend needs to be chayiv the same korban as he is. So when we say that if Aharon slaughters Reuven's korban with the intention of doing zrikas adam for Shimon, it's possible. It's when Shimon needs to bring the same type of korban that Reuven needs to bring. But if Reuven needs to bring a chatas and Shimon needs to bring an olah, and Aharon slaughters Reuven's korban chatas with the intention of doing zrikas adam for Shimon, who needs to bring korban olah, then Reuven's korban chatas is going to be kosher, because it's v'chipur olav la chaveru dum yedidei. And if Reuven's bringing a chatas and Shimon's bringing an olah, his friend is not considered like him. It's a different category. Drink a stick of water. V'marove says Rove. Chatas sheshchota al mi she'enu mechuyev klu. Now this is an interesting one. I think I touched upon it maybe yesterday. This is a real interesting one. Right. I think maybe I touched on it yesterday because I think yesterday I wanted to say, I think I read somewhere that if a person isn't chayiv to bring a korban chatas and they set aside an animal to be a korban chatas, even though they don't need to bring a korban chatas, I think I've read somewhere that it's not, it's just nothing. Or if you set aside a korban as a korban chatas when you don't need to bring one, I think it's just not anything. It's not hektish, it's nothing. Anyways, but here Rava says something extremely interesting. Wow, there's so much interesting stuff in that line. So Rava says that if Aharon slaughters Reuven's korban chatas with the intention of doing zrikas adam for Shimon. Now the thing is, Shimon doesn't need to bring any korban. Shimon didn't make any neders. Shimon doesn't need to bring a korban. And Aharon slaughters Reuven's korban chatas with the intention of doing zrikas adam for Shimon. We say posel. Now we had said a second ago, when is it posel in that case? When Shimon needs to bring a korban chatas. If Aharon slaughters Reuven's korban chatas with the intention of doing zrikas adam for Shimon, who also needs to bring a korban chatas, we said posel. If Shimon has to bring a korban olah, we said it's kosher. And now we're saying if Shimon doesn't have to bring anything at all, posel. Why? Because she'ein licha adam b'Yisrael she'ein mechuyev esei. There is not any yid who doesn't at least have to bring a korban for at least being mevatel mitzvahs esei. Everyone's done something that they should be bringing a korban for. Okay, fine. So we're saying, look, technically speaking, there really isn't such a thing as a person who doesn't have any korbanos to bring. Yeah, maybe he's mevatel some mitzvahs esei or something. Probably needs to bring a korban, and since he needs to bring a korban, even if it's just a mitzvahs esei, so by default a korban chatas would be mechaper for a mitzvahs esei. Technically, a korban chatas would be mechaper for mitzvahs esei. And in a certain sense, therefore, anybody, right, a person who has no korbanos to bring, technically can be considered as someone who a korban chatas would be mechaper for him too. And therefore, by default, you can view Shimon who technically doesn't need to bring any korban, as somebody who technically is chayiv on some level, to bring a korban chatas. Now, you wouldn't actually bring a korban chatas unless you had a reason to, but when Aharon slaughters Reuven's korban chatas with the intention of doing zrikas adam for Shimon, it would be possible because it could be considered like Shimon is also somebody who has to bring a korban chatas by default. Very, very, very interesting stuff. Okay, again, V'amarava says, Rava, chatas sheshchoto al mi she'einu mechuyev klum, a korban chatas that's slaughtered, right? Aharon slaughters Reuven's korban chatas with the intention of doing zrikas adam for Shimon, who technically speaking doesn't have to bring any korbanis. Nonetheless, psula, the korban chatas is psula. Why? Because it's considered as though Shimon is chayiv to bring a korban chatas in some way. Because there's no yid who isn't chayiv at least for violating some mitzvahs essay. Everybody has at least been mevatel some mitzvahs essay, and therefore they're at least in some way shaykh to korban chatas, and therefore it's considered, Allah v'lo chaveru. V'amarav says Rava chatas michaperes al chai ve'esei. There you have it. So says Rava that a korban chatas can be mechaper for chai ve'esei. Person's chayiv who is mevatel mitzvahs essay. So korban chatas can be mechaper for that. Mekav v'chomer al chai ve'kreisus mechaperes al chai ve'esei l'koshikin. If a korban chatas is able to be mechaper for a chiyuv karis, eating chaylev, certainly it can be mechaper for being mevatel mitzvahs essay. Now, frag the Gemara, l'meimer is this to say the bas minoi. Now that's interesting. So if we've just been talking about this really interesting concept that technically a person, anybody, every yid is probably at least mevatel some mitzvahs essay, and therefore it's shaykh to say that he's chayiv a korban chatas. Does that mean that somebody who's mevatel a mitzvahs essay is considered somebody who's chayiv to bring a korban chatas? It's like within the realm of chatas. V'omer Rav, it says Rav, chatas sheshchato al mi shemechuyev chatas psula mi shemechuyev ola kshera. So Gemara asks an interesting question, which is that we had just said a few minutes ago that if Aharon slaughters Reuven's korban chatas with the intention of doing zrikas adam for Shimon, who needs to bring a korban ola, we said the korban chatas is kshera, because Shimon, who needs to bring an ola, would not be considered, right? It would be not considered, right? We need chaver or dum yadidei, and this is andra. This is different because Shimon has to bring an ola, Reuven's bringing a chatas. But now, if we're saying, so meaning, why would Shimon be bringing a korban ola? Let's assume he's bringing a korban ola because he's in mevatel mitzvahs essay, like we talked about. I don't remember. Did we even talk about it? I don't know what's what. Maybe not. Maybe we haven't talked about it. I don't know what's what. But anyways, we talked about it. Was that yesterday's? I don't even remember what's what. I think that was yesterday's daf. I'll tell you something, Chevra. I'll give you a hint between you and me. I recorded yesterday's daf about 2 hours ago, and I can't even remember what. I don't know what's flying. Anyways, Daf Yomi Zevachim is amazing. Okay. Anyways, where are we? So we had said that. Okay. So Mistama, why is Shimon bringing a korban ola? Mistama, because let's assume he was mevatel mitzvahs essay, so therefore he's bringing a korban ola. He's mevatel mitzvahs essay, therefore he's bringing a korban ola. Now, if we're saying that somebody who's mevatel mitzvahs essay is be'etzem shaykh to korban chatas, well, then we had said that if Aharon slaughters Reuven's korban chatas with the intention of doing zrikas adam for Shimon, who is chayav to bring a korban ola, Reuven's chatas is kshera because Shimon is bringing an ola, he's bringing a chatas, they're considered different. But if we're saying that, well, Shimon's bringing an ola because there's mevatel mitzvahs essay, and mitzvahs essay is actually shaykh to chatas, so in a sense, it's considered like Shimon actually is taka somebody who's chayav a korban chatas, and therefore, when Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban chatas with the intention of doing zirkas adam for Shimon, who has to bring a korban ola, but technically he's bringing korban ola because of a mitzvahs essay, which is technically something that's shaykh to korban chatas, it should be ola v'lo chaver, and it should be and it should be puzzled. All right. What do you think of that question? It's very nice, right? And for the Gemara, look. When we're saying, like, this whole concept of somebody by default being considered chayv a korban chatas because by default is mistamar, is mivatel mitzvahs essay. So we're not saying that he's like literally chayav a korban chatas, okay? And if Shimon had already set aside and designated a korban to be a korban ola to be mechaper for his mitzvahs essay, okay, so then that's it. It's an ola. It's not a chatas. We're not saying he's chayav, but no. If he already set aside his korban ola to be mechaper for being mevatel mitzvahs essay, like, okay, he's handling it with an ola. He's not handling it with a chatas. Forget about it. So like, mikiva lo mechaper. It's right, sort of. Right, right. We had this at the end of yesterday's discussion. At the end of yesterday's, 2 days ago's daf. I don't remember what's what. At the end of 2 days ago's daf. That right, mikufi mechaper. It's like secondary. A korban chatas is like secondarily mechaper for mitzvahs essay, but not primarily. And if you already set aside a korban ola to be mechaper for your mitzvahs essay, great, go with that. Forget about the korban chatas. If you haven't yet set anything aside, okay, so we could say that it's shaykh to korban chatas to the extent that if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban chatas with the intention of doing zirkas adam for Shimon, who technically doesn't have to bring any korbanos, but we could say that by default it's probably mevatel mitzvahs essay, and therefore shaykh to chatas, and therefore Ruvain's chatas is possible. Biseder. But if Shimon had already set aside a korban ola, then forget about the whole chatas thing. The whole chatas thing is just a secondary thing, not a primary thing. If Shimon already separated a korban ola for his essay, forget about chatas. It's not going to be shaykh in that case. Ola sheshchota shelo lishmah. Okay, so Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban ola shelo lishmah. I guess that's a shlom. Okay, fine. Also lizrok dama shelo lishmah. Okay, we saw this. Where do we see this? And that Beis Amaral. All the way at the beginning of Zevachim, which was, I guess, apparently less than a week ago, like just less than a week ago. I see Beis Gimel Dalet Hey Vav Zayin. This is day 6 since then, but it feels like it was quite a while ago. Anyways, Moses Pirka, as we saw at the beginning of the parak, right? That if Ruvain is bringing a korban ola, and Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban ola with the intention of a shlomim, let's say. So we said that the ola is still kosher, just it's not going to be ola baylim shem chova. So says Rava, just because you had the wrong kavanah by the shchita, and now it's no longer ola baylim shem chova, but don't now have the wrong kavanah also for the Kabbalah and the halacha and the zirga. It's not like, okay, throw in the towel kind of thing. No, you should still do the rest of the avodas properly, kosherly. We said there's 2 possible reasons. One is because the pasuk would be, as we learned already on Daf Beis and another time since then, maybe even another time, I can't remember. Right, we said if a person brings that neder and the korban is offered properly, so then it'll be mekayim the neder, and it'll fulfill his neder. But if, let's say, the shchita was not lishma, so then it's still a nedava. And then, right, so we're saying, okay, it won't fulfill your neder, but okay, we'll just view this korban as a separate korban that he's bringing as a nedava. And you should, of course, offer the nedavar properly. Don't just throw in the towel and start doing everything possibly. No, okay, so the shchita was shelo lishma, but do the rest of the korban, that's a kosher korban, do that lishma. That's the pasuk thing, the pasuk side of things, and the logic side of things is just because you messed up one thing, don't mess up everything. Let's read it again inside. V'omar, Rava says, Rava, Ola sheshchatzo shelo lishma. If a hired slaughters Reuben's korban Ola shelo lishma, which we say is still going to be a kosher korban, but it's not Ola l'baylim l'shem chova. Also, this Oktam shelo lishma, don't now just do zrikas adam shelo lishma and throw in the towel. And the reason for this is either you can base it on a pasuk or based on logic. The pasuk would be Motzis v'sechet tishma v'gomer, right? That whole pasuk of kashin adarta shemekechin adava. If it's shalol lishma, so it won't satisfy your neder, but it'll still be an adava, and do that, offer that adava properly. Alternatively, svara mishum deshani bavchule, just because you messed up with one of the avodas, it doesn't mean that you have to mess up with all the avodas. Kiddush Pirka, as we saw at the beginning of the parak. Gonna quickly drink a little more water. So now we have another Meimer of Rava. When I learned this Meimer Rava the first time, I got really stuck on it. I'm not sure if it was just late at night or something like that, and maybe my brain just wasn't working so good. But also, Chevra, the other day, I think it was maybe Daf Hey. So we had learned about the scenario with the Yoledes. That you had a Yoledes who had to bring a Korbin Yoledes, a Chatas Ha'of, and an Olis Behema. She offered a Chatas Ha'of, and then she died. And now the estate needs to bring an Ola Behema. Right? And we took the time to kind of work through the details of that complicated sugya of Korbin La'achar Misa, but because we did the work then to kind of flesh out the different moving pieces there and the different owners and heirs and whatever, so I think that'll help us. Not I think, I mean, we have the tools that we need to understand this next section. V'omar Rava says, Rava, Ola ba la'achar misa. A korban ola that is being brought la'achar misa, right? Because we also talked about shibud d'oraisa and stuff. So we have the different moving pieces that we can put in place to kind of set up a scenario over here. So what we'll say here is going on is that Yaakov died. Okay? Yaakov died, and when he died, he had to bring a korban ola. Okay? So let's just assume all the sort of easiest route. Let's take the easiest route, the happy path, which is Yaakov died. He had to bring a korban ola. Let's assume that now his heirs need to bring the korban ola. Let's say shibud d'oraisa, whatever it is. Now it's the responsibility of his heirs to bring the korban ola for him. Okay, so now they have to bring a korban ola. Fine, great. So again, a korban ola that is being offered after death by the heirs. Yaakov died. He needed to bring a korban ola. His heirs, right, Reuven, is now going to offer it for him. Shchata b'shinui kodesh, if Aharon slaughters Reuven's korban ola, which he's bringing because he has to, because his father Yaakov had to offer it. He's offering it for his father Yaakov. Now, Aharon slaughtered Reuven's ola with the intention of shlamim. Psula. Well, it's meaning it's not going to be really, it'll still be ksheira, but it's not going to be all the baylim shemchovin. He'll have to bring a replacement. Reuven's going to have to bring a replacement. Right? Let's assume that there was a shibud d'oraisa. Let's assume that there was Reuven has a chiyuv to bring the ola of his father Yaakov. If it was slaughtered shelo lishma, so Reuven has to bring a different korban then as an ola. B'shinui baylim ksheira. But if a hired slaughtered Reuven's korban ola with the intention of doing zugas adam for Shimon, then ksheira. There's no concept of baylim. Who's the baylim? Yaakov. Yaakov's gestorben. So therefore, there's no So in a situation like this, there's not going to be any concept of shinui baylim b'chlal. And therefore, if Aharon slaughtered Reuven's ola that he's bringing on behalf of his deceased father Yaakov, and Aharon has the intention of during the shechita to do zvikas adam for Shimon, the korban's still kosher because there's no concept of baylim nachar misa. Rav Pinchas ber Rav Ami Omar yesh baylim nachar misa. Pinchas ber Rav Ami says there is concept of baylim nachar misa. Who's that? Reuven. Reuven's now the owner, which is interesting, right? Meaning, right, this relates back to Daf Hey, right, where we were talking about, right, that was the whole thing on Daf Hey, right? Rabbi Lazar was, right, that was with Rish Lakish, and Rabbi Lazar was saying, look, we have a precedent for this concept of a korban that's kosher, but is not ola the baylim l'shem chova, and he brought the example from the Yoledis, who's now dead. She died, and now her heirs are bringing the ola for her, and we're saying that that's an example of the korban is kosher, but it's not ola the baylim. Who's baylim? The Yoledis, who's now dead. It's not ola the baylim because she's dead, but the korban itself is kosher. So now, interestingly, right, so now that's also why Rava said that there's no concept of Shinui baylim, because who's the baylim? The baylim is Yaakov in our case, and Yaakov's dead. Says of Pinchas Brei de Rav Ami, that actually, the way I'm seeing it, hopefully it's correct, is that the way I'm looking at it is that the baylim shifts from Yaakov to Reuven now. And therefore, if Aharon slaughtered this Ola with the intention of doing Zukas Adam for Shimon, says a Pinchas Breder of Yaakov, the Rav Ami, that's going to be Shinu Baylim and it's going to be possible. So for Pinchas Breder of Ami Omer, Yesh Baylim La'achar Misa, there is Baylim La'achar Misa, Reuven, the heirs. The Rav Ashi, the Pinchas Breder of Ami, says Rav Ashi to Pinchas Breder of Ami, Davka Komer Meir. Rav Ashi asked Rav Pinchas Breder of Ami, do you really mean that? Do you really mean that Reuven is the heirs? Right? Davka kamer mar yesh bayim la'achar misa uvai le'isuye ola achrise. Like, do you literally mean that? And you argue with Rava, whereas Rava says that if Aharon slaughtered this korban ola with the intention of doing zukas adam for Shimon, so Rava had said the ola is kosher because there's no baylim la'achar misa, because the baylim is Yaakov, and Yaakov is dead. Now it says of Pinchas Breder of Ami that the baylim shifts now to be Reuven, the heir. Now, if it literally shifts to be Reuven, so Rav Ashi asks for Pinchas Breder of Ami, do you mean that literally, that Reuven is now the baylim to the extent that if Aharon slaughters the korban with the intention of doing zukas adam for Shimon, Reuven's going to have to bring a replacement because the korban is pasul and lo alu levalim l'shem chova, and he's still going to have to bring a kosher korban in order to satisfy the chova of his father Yaakov, who's now dead. And it's his responsibility, as you know, it's the responsibility of the estate. Or maybe Rav Pinchas Breder Rav Ami asks Rav Ashi, right? So Rav Ashi asks Rav Pinchas Breder Rav Ami, maybe what you meant though is simply that that Reuven becomes the owner to the extent that when offering this korban ola, if Reuven was mevatel some mitzvahs assays, it could be mechaper for those, but he's not literally the owner to the extent that there's shinui baylim would be a problem. Pinchas Breder Rav Ami says, I mean it literally. I literally mean Reuven, that the ownership shifts from Yaakov to Reuven, and Reuven is now the baylim. And if Aharon slaughters the ola with the intention of doing zukas adam for Shimon, apostle, Reuven's going to have to be going to have to bring a replacement now in order to fulfill the obligation of the estate to bring a korban ola for Yaakov. Okay. Rava says, Rava, ola dornu. Now this is really, really interesting. Because up until now we've been saying that if you're mevatel mitzvah seseh, we talked about a person didn't take lulav on sukkos, a person didn't read Kriya Shema, so he's got to bring a korban ola. Person mevatel mitzvah seseh brings a korban ola. Says Rava, an ola is actually just a gift. That's it. Ola Dorinu, it's a gift. Heichi Damiaso, Ideleka Tshuve. 1 second. What's the deal with this Ola being a gift? If we're talking about, a guy didn't take lulav on Sukkis, he's mevatel mitzvahs esev ulekachtem lechem b'yom rishon, and he's not doing tshuva, well then zevach rishonim toeva. Well then his Korbin Ola, his Korbin is an abomination. Right? He's mevatel mitzvahs esev and he doesn't care, he doesn't do tshuva. So you can't bring a Korbin for that. V'yideika tshuva, and if he did do tshuva, Hatani, we learned a brayso. We saw this in Masechta Shavuos. Of our mitzvahs essay v'shav loizos mishum atshvichalim le. Person is mevatel mitzvahs essay and he does tshuva, he immediately is forgiven. So if that's the case, technically you don't need to bring. You don't need to bring a Korbin Ola in order to get kapara. You already we're saying if you did tshuva of mitzvahs essay, immediately you're forgiven. So what's the deal with the Korbin Ola then? We're saying if you didn't do tshuva, you can't bring a Korbin Ola because it's zevach Hashem toeva. If you did tshuva, so you already did tshuva, you're immediately mechalno. So what's the point? We're even talking about bringing a Korbin Ola to be mechaber for mitzvah essay. It sounds like if you do tshuva for mitzvah essay, so you die, you mechalno. What do you have to bring a Korbin Ola for? Lishmah mina doranu. It's a present. Tanam we also learn a brayso. Reb Shimon chatas lamiba. Says Reb Shimon, why are we bringing a Korbin chatas? Chatas lama ba. What do you mean? Why are you being Korbin chatas l'chaper? What do you? If you ate chayla back, then you're being Korbin chatas. What do you mean? Why do you being Korbin chatas? Ella lama ba lifnei ola. How come there are scenarios when you have a Korbin chatas? Right. Sometimes you have to bring a chatas and an ola. So by your lettuce, bring chatas and an ola. Why are there scenarios where one brings? Although I think Tosfos points out that not in every scenario that there's a chatas and an ola did you sin, but anyways, I think maybe by Tumas Mikdash for Kodesh, maybe there's a chatas and an ola. Yeah, does Rashi say anything? Okay. Anyways, in instances where you have to bring a Korbin chatas and a Korbin ola, so the chatas comes first. So when Reb Shimon says, why do we bring a chatas and why do we bring the chatas first? When you have a Korbin chatas and a Korbin ola, why does the Korbin chatas come first? The praklit shenichnos, well, it's like if a person didn't have, is in trouble, and the lawyer goes in and sorts it out for him. The lawyer is the Korbin chatas. You bring the Korbin chatas, and you kind of get things sorted out. And when after the lawyer has sorted things out for you, and you're forgiven, ritza plaket nichnas dor nachar, well then you give a gift. So the reason for the Korbin Ola is as a gift. Right? If a person sinned, then you bring a Korbin chatas. First you bring the Korbin chatas, you kind of get the atonement. And once the Korbin chatas is done, the Korbin Ola comes as a gift. And we're saying also, even by, if I'm saying correctly, it sounds to me like we're saying that even by mitzvahs essay, so you do tshuva. When you do tshuva, you immediately get forgiven. And once you've gotten forgiven, then you bring a gift. So it's not that the olah has been mechaper, but once you've done tshuva for having been mevatel mitzvahs essay, you then bring a Korbin Ola as a gift to the Rabbanan Shalom. Now we get up to the second and final portion of today's daf, Korbin Pesach's Lishmah requirement. Okay, of course we saw it in the first Mishnah of Masechta Zevachim, which we are still learning. I think this goes until Daf Yud Aleph, I think. Anyways, we learned in the first Mishnah that any of the korbanos that were slaughtered shelo lishma, they're still kosher. 2 exceptions. Korbin Pesach and Korbin Chatas. We're going to learn about Korbin Pesach now. And tomorrow we will learn about the source for Korbin Chatas. Says the Gemara, Chutz min Pesach v'Chatas v'chulei Pesach minolan. How do we know that a Pesach must be, all the avodas have to be done Lishma, and if not, Pasul? The pasuk says, Shomer es chodesh ha'aviv ve'asisa Pesach. Guard the month of Aviv and do Pesach Shu Kol Asiyosov L'Shem Pesach. All of the asiyas, all of the doings, all of the avodas, shchita, kabbalah, olacha, zrika, all must be done with the intention of a korban chatas, not any other korban. Ashkachan Shinui kodesh. Okay, so we see that by Shinui kodesh, right, the shem chatas, not the shem any other korban, all the avodas have to be Lishmah. Have to be Lishmah. Shinui baylim minolan. Okay, so now what about Shinui baylim? How do we know that it has to be done for the offerer and not for anybody else? Tichsiv, as the Pasuk says, V'amartem Zevach Pesach Hu. You say the Zevach Pesach, the slaughtering of the Pesach. Shetei Zvicha L'Shem Pesach, that the slaughtering of the Korbin Pesach has to be L'Shem Korbin Pesach. The slaughtering of the Korbin Pesach has to be for the Korbin Pesach. That the slaughtering of the Korbin Pesach has to be for the Korbin Pesach. L'Shinui kodesh. Now, it's not to say that you have to slaughter it for the Korbin Pesach and not for any other Korbin, because we already learned that from Vasis and Pesach. Shekol Siyosa of L'Shem Pesach. So what is the teaching Zevach Pesach? It means L'Shem baylim. We already learned the Shinui kodesh. This is now Shinui baylim. So menu'in l'shinui kodesh, tenu'in l'shinui baylim. So if we don't need it to teach Shinui kodesh, so say it's talking about Shinui baylim. Ashkachon l'mitzvah la'akiv minolan. How do we? So now we found. So I think that. So we're going to end up kind of rejecting this, but my understanding is that we're saying when it comes to zvicha, to slaughtering a Korbin Pesach for the right person, right? When it comes to Shinui baylim, so we see that the zvicha, the slaughtering of the Korbin Pesach, has to be for Reuven and not for Shimon. La'akiv b'nolan. How do we know that requirement of Shinui baylim, of zvicha, of the Shinui of the zvicha of the Korbin Pesach for Reuven, not for Shimon? How do we know that that's not just l'chatchila, but even b'di eved? The Pasuk says, "V'zavachto Pesach l'Hashem Elokecho." That the Pasuk says, which Pasuk is this? Okay, fine. Okay, the Pasuk says, "V'zavachto Pesach l'Hashem Elokecho," slaughter the Pesach, and that is kind of doubling down to say that the slaughtering of the Korbin Pesach has to be for Reuven, not for Shimon. And that is even b'di eved. Maskefla, Rav Safra. Rav Safra asks a question. Have zavachto lachiude also. 1 second, that pasuk of zavachto Pesach Hashem Elokecha is not to teach me that slaughtering the Korbin Pesach for Shimon is possible even b'di eved. No, it's not teaching me that. Hami boy l'lichtav Nachman. 1 second, zavachto Pesach Hashem Elokecha. What's that pasuk? Zavachto Pesach Hashem Elokecha tzoinu vaker. That pasuk is needed for Rav Nachman. Damer of Nachman, Amar Abba Bar Minayin, the Moser Pesach Shekariv Shlomim. This is going to come up again in the next few days. How do we know that Moser Pesach Kariv Shlomim? So, let's say you have a animal that you set aside to be a Korbin Pesach and you lost it. Let's say. So you get a new animal and you slaughter that one as your Korbin Pesach, and then at some later point, you find the original. So what do you do? I mean, right? Maybe you find it 2 weeks later, whatever it is. So what do you do with this animal that you had already set aside as your Korbin Pesach, but you ended up using a different animal because this one got lost? So you could bring it as a shlomim, as a Korbin shlomim. It's brought as a Korbin shlomim. Shneimar, the Pasuk says, "V'zavachta Hashem Elokecha tzon uvakar," that it says you'll slaughter a Korbin Pesach for Hashem tzon uvakar. Chaver. No, what's the problem there? Zavachta Pesach Hashem Elokecha tzon uvaker. Korbin Pesach is either a sheep or a goat. Baker is cows. Why are we saying that your Korbin Pesach is going to be cows? Korbin Pesach is only from sheep and from goats, not from cows. So why are we saying Zavachta Pesach Hashem Elokecha tzon uvaker? Mikan leMoser Pesach. So what it's teaching is that if you have a leftover Korbin Pesach, if you have a Korbin Pesach that ended up not being used, and now it's after Pesach, or it's after Shechita, whatever the time for the Korbin Pesach, whatever it is. So what do you do with it now? Well, you offer it as a Korbin that, which Korbin? A type of Korbin that can be offered either from sheep or from cows. I mean, here we're talking about obviously a sheep or a goat, because we're talking about the leftover Korbin Pesach, but meaning what you do with it is that you slaughter it as the category of korbanos that can be offered from sheep, goats, cows, anything. What's that category? Shlomim. So that pasuk of V'zavachta Hashem Ukechot, V'zavachta Pesach Hashem Ukechot Tzonu V'akar, is not teaching me that slaughtering Reuven's Korbin Pesach for Shimon is also b'di'evet. No, it's going to teach like Rav Nachman teaches that Moser Pesach, a leftover Korbin Pesach, a Pesach out that has been designated, but now it's past the time of Korbin Pesach, that is offered as a shlom. I'm going to drink more water. Okay, so therefore, El Amar of Safra, rather says Rav Safra, V'zavachta Pesach, Lichtav Nachman. Okay, so rather says Rav Safra that the pasuk of Zavachta Pesach Hashem Ukecha Tzonu V'akar is like Rav Nachman teaches. It's not teaching anything about Shinui baylim. No. Shomer es Chodesh Aviv. The first pasuk that we quoted of Shomer is called V'asisa Pesach. Kol asiyos have to be with the kavanah of Pesach, and from that we learn that Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika have to be the shame Pesach. They can't be Shinui kodesh. The mitzvah b'Shinui kodesh. So that pasuk of Shomer Chodesh Aviv teaches Shinui kodesh. You have to do all the avodas of Korbin Pesach for Korbin Pesach. Now we haven't yet learned that if you don't do it for the Korbin Pesach, it's osur, even b'di'evet. We haven't learned that part out yet, but we learned out so far just the mitzvah that has to be for Korbin Pesach, with the intention of Korbin Pesach, not any other Korbin, by Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika. V'amaytem Zevach Pesach, that next pasuk of V'amaytem Zevach Pesach, b'Shinui baylim the mitzvah. So V'amaytem Zevach Pesach taught us that Zevach Pesach, the slaughtering of the Korbin Pesach, so it's not to teach us that it needs to be the same Korbin Pesach, because we learned that out from Shomer's Chodesh Aviv. So V'amaytem Zevach Pesach is teaching that you have to slaughter the Korbin Pesach for the owner. It has to be slaughtered for Reuven, not for Shimon. So B'Shinui baylim, and that teaches the mitzvah, that there's a mitzvah. But we haven't learned anything b'di'evet. Right? We've learned Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika, L'shem Korbin Pesach, L'chatchila. And also slaughtering the Korbin Pesach for Reuven, not for Shimon, L'chatchila. But when it says, V'amaytem Zevach Pesach, who? Le'akev be'nocha v'ocha. And when it says, who? It has to be this way. Well, that's to say, even b'di'evet. It has to be the shame, right? Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika. Has to be the shame Korbin Pesach, even b'di'evet. And what we've learned out so far is also, right, in terms of Shinui baylim, the Shchita would have to be for Reuven, not for Shimon, even b'di'evet. The Ashkechon Zvicha Sha'avodas Minalan. Now, when it came to Shinui baylim, all we had learned was Zvicha, Zevach Pesach. The Zvicha has to be for Korbin Pesach, but with the Shem Pesach, we said we would know Shinui kodesh, it's Shinui baylim. So we only know Shinui baylim, bein la mitzvah, bein la akev, right? The chatchila b'di'evet, right? The chatchila is the mitzvah, b'di'evet is la akev. So bein la mitzvah, bein la akev. By Shinui baylim, we only know Zvicha. How do we know also not just the Shchita, but also the Kabbalah Sadam, Holacha Sadam, Zrika Sadam? Hol v'gali gali. Says the Gemara, well, once we already know that by Shinui kodesh, it applies to all 4 avodas. Shchita, Kabbalah, Halacha, Zrika. So the same thing by Shinui baylim. Rashi Omer, Rashi says we don't say that. We don't say, well, just because that if Shinui kodesh applies to all avodas, then okay, Shinui baylim too. No, we don't say that. Ella, rather. Okay, this is an interesting pshat. I'm going to drink some water before the interesting pshat. It's a little bit of a ping-pong pshat. It's going to go a little bit back and forth, but it's gewaldig. El avodos minolan. How do we know all of the avodas by Shinui baylim? How do you know all the avodas? Well, from here. The pasuk says, okay, we had that pasuk. We've seen it already, I think at least once. The pasuk says, everything is compared. All the korbanos are compared to shlomim. V'tanya, and we learned about it. When the pasuk says, in the very next pasuk says, beyond tzavosos b'nei Yisrael, la'akav is korbanim. So that pasuk, the very next pasuk, includes in the whole mix of korbanos that are compared to shlomim, zebechor, umaiser, upesach. This includes bechor, maiser, and pesach. Hikisha akosov lishlamim. Okay, here's where things get interesting. So we see that even Korbin Pesach is also compared to Korbin Shlomim. And now, Ma Shlomim, Ben Shinui Kodesh, Ben Shinui Baylim. So now by Korbin Shlomim, we learned this out already, I don't know, maybe Daf Daled, Daf Gimel, Daf Daled. That when it comes to Korbin Shlomim, whether we're talking about Shinui Kodesh, right, the Shem Shlomim, whether we're talking about Shinui Baylim, with the intention of the right person, but inon lemitzvah, so you need it to be l'shem shlomim, you need it to be for the right person. So I've called ben shinui kodesh, ben shinui baylim the mitzvah. So now, basically, the way that what we're learning now is that, so we're saying, okay, by Korbin Shlomim, we said that whether we're talking about Shinui Kodesh, whether we're talking about Shinui Baylim, by Korbin Shlomim, it has to be the Shem Shlomim, and it has to be for the right person. And by Korbin Shlomim, it's not B'diavad, right? Korbin Shlomim, if you don't have the right intention, so it's still going to be kosher, it's just not Ol L'Badim Shem Chova, but it's not B'diavad, it's not Me'akev. So by Korbin Shlomim, whether it's Shinui Baylim, whether it's Shinui Kodesh, there is that lemitzvah, it should be l'shem Shlomim man for the person who is bringing it. And we compare Korbin Pesach, right? And then the very next pasuk says, B'yom tzavosos b'nei Yisrael la'akav korbanim zebechor ma'aser Pesach. So we're comparing Pesach to Korbin Shlomim, and therefore from that we know that by Korbin Pesach, whether we're talking about Shinui Baylim, whether we're talking about Shinui Kodesh, it has to be it have to have the right intention. And this would apply to all the avodas, right? Just like by Korbin Shlomim, Shchita, Kabbalah, Halacha, Zrika, they all have to be l'shem Shlomim, and they all have to be l'shem baylim. And we're comparing Korbin Pesach to Shlomim, so we know this. So now, just by the comparison to Korbin Shlomim, we know from the comparison of Korbin Pesach to Korbin Shlomim, the Hekish, we know that by Korbin Pesach, both by Shinui Baylim and by Shinui Kodesh, Shchita, Kabbalah, Halacha, Zrika has to be l'shem Shlomim, l'shem Korbin Pesach and l'shem Baylim. But that's only the mitzvah, it's not la'akev. How do you know la'akev? Well, we know la'akev because we had the pasuk earlier of Shomer Chodesh Aviv, Asisa Pesach, K'sheyeh Kol Asiros l'shem Pesach, and we already know the mitzvah from the comparison to Shlomim. And how do we know la'akev? Well, we have the pasuk of Shomer Chodesh Ha'aviv, Asisa Pesach, Kol Asiyos, have to be L'Shem Pesach. That's even B'di'evet, they have to be L'Shem Pesach, Givaldik. So what do we know? So we know that when it comes to Shinui Kodesh, Shchita, Kabbalah, Olacha, Zrika, have to be L'Shem Korbin Pesach, not just L'Mitzvah, but even L'Akev. Done. We know that. Now, from the comparison to Shlamim, we also know that in terms of Shinui Baylim, Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika need to be for the right person, L'Mitzvah. How do we know yet L'Akev? Well, when it came to Shinui Baylim, all we had was V'amartim Zevach Pesachu. Zevach Pesach. That the Zvicha has to be the Shem Korbin Pesach. We said it since we already know Shinui Kodesh is talking about Shinui Baylim. So now from the comparison to Shlamim, we know that Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika by Shinui, right? From the comparison to Shlamim, from the comparison of Pesach to Shlamim, we know that Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika need to be the Shem Baylim. But in terms of B'di'eved, the Akev, we only know that by Zvicha from V'amartim Zevach Pesach. We only know that by the Zvicha. So now says the Gemara, Ucheshlamim, and like Shlamim, Ashlamim, Bein Zvicha, Bein Shara Avotis, Lo Chalakta Ben L'Mitzvah. So, and just like by Korbin Shlamim, whether we're talking about Zvicha, whether the other voters, whether we're talking about Shchita, whether we're talking about Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika, we said that it has to be L'Shem Baylim L'Mitzvah. So at Pesach also, therefore by Korbin Pesach, Lo Tachlok Bo, don't make any differences Bein Zvicha L'Shar Avodas, whether we're talking about Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika, Le'akev, to say even B'di'eved Le'akev. So meaning, it's a little bit of ping pong, and we have to read a lot into that. But basically, to go over that, from the comparison, so there's like a two-step comparison to Shlamim. The first step of the comparison is saying, well, just like Shlamim, Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika needs to be L'Shem Shlamim, and L'Shem the owner of the Korbin. So same thing by the Korbin Pesach. Now that's L'Mitzvah. I don't know the Akev. Well, we have the pasuk of Shomer is Chodesh Ha'aviv Asisa Pesach that taught even La'akev by Shchita, Kabbalah, by Oshei Kol Asiyos L'Shem Pesach, even La'akev by Shinui Kodesh. Now we know also La'akev by Shinui Baylim, but just by Zvicha. How do we know that Shinui Baylim is Ma'akev not just by Zvicha, but also by Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika? Well, that's the second step, which is, well, just like when it came to Shlamim, there was no difference between Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika, L'Mitzvah by Shinui Baylim. So also in terms of L'Akev by Shinui Baylim by Korbin Pesach, there's not going to be any difference between Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika. So we have learned that essentially through the comparison to the juxtaposition of Korbin Pesach to Shlamim, that Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, and Zrika need to be as a Korbin Pesach, right? The Shem Korbin Pesach and the Shem Baylim, both L'Mitzvah and Le'akev. Okay, now let's wrap up. Elahu Lomali. Okay, V'amartim Zevach Pesach Hu. We wanted to say that Hu was Ma'akev, but we ended up learning out everything from Shlamim. So what do we need? V'amartim Zevach Pesach Hu. So Kedetani, as we learn in Ebos, in the name of Pesach Hu, B'Shchita. So it says V'amartim Zevach Pesach Hu. So by Korbin Pesach it says Hu by Shchita. Le'akev, and it's Ma'akev when it comes to Korbin Pesach. Aval Osham Lo Nemar Bahu El Achar Tarse Murad Vu Atzmal Shaluk to Emurav Kosher. This has to do with the machlokas between, right, in our Mishnah, Rabbi Eliezer had said in our Mishnah, that not only Korbin Pesach and Korbin Chatas, but also Korbin Osham is ma'akev. If you do it shelo lishma, it's mamish pasul. So we're going to see, I think on Daf Yud Aleph, Machlokas Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua. The Rabbi Eliezer says that, okay, it says who by Korbin Asham. So that means that that it has to be Lishmah and it's ma'akev by Korbin Asham. But it says Rabbi Yoshua, no. It says who. When it says who by Korbin Pesach, that's in the context of Shchita. And the Shchita, right? So there in Shchita you have to do Lishma. But when it says who by Korbin Asham, it's in the context of Haktorah Semurim. Haktorah Semurim Bichlal, even if you don't even do the Haktorah Semurim Bichlal, it's still going to be a kosher Korbin technically. So certainly it's not going to have to be Lishma. It's in the context of a portion of the offering that technically even if you missed the whole thing, it's still kosher. So certainly we're not going to learn out that Lishma is ma'akib by Korbin Asham from where it says who. So again, Elahu Lamali, why does it say B'matam Zevach who? What do we learn from that? Kedetani is learning about it. Never Pesach who b'shchita le'akib. So it says by Korbin Pesach who in the context of shchita, and it's ma'akev by the Korbin Pesach. If it's lo lishma, then it's mamish possible by Korbin Pesach. Aval Asham lo nemer bahu ela achar Haktorah Semurim. But by Korbin Asham, it only says who in the context of the Haktorah Semurim. Ru atzmo shlo iktiru shlo ukteru emur of kosher. But by Korbin Asham, technically speaking, even if you bichlal didn't do the Haktorah Semurim, it would still be kosher. So lishma is not going to ruin it. You know, it's not even if you did it by Asham Shalol Lishma, based on the fact that it says who in the context of Emurim, that's not going to be a reason to learn out that by Asham Shchita Shalol Lishma makes it possible from the who that's written by the Emurim, which is a step that technically isn't even needed. No. So therefore so why does it say who by Korbin Pesach? To compare the who by Korbin Pesach to the who by Asham, to say that by Korbin Pesach it's by the Zvicha, and that's why it's Me'akev. But by the Asham, it's not by the Zvicha, it's by the Haktorah Semurim, and it's not Ma'akev by Korbin Asham. Alright, that was Daf Zayin of Masechta Zevachim. The first part of today's Daf, we learned Shinui kodesh and Shinui baylim scenarios. Yeah, it was just a whole bunch of scenarios, and Toda, L'shem Todas Chavero, Chatas Dam, Chatas Chelev, like all sorts of stuff. You started with the intention of your friend who wasn't actually chayav a korban, all sorts of things like that. And then we learned about Korbin Pesach's Lishma requirement. Of course, we know from the first Mishnah already that a Korbin Pesach, if any of the avodas are done Shalol Lishma, forget about it. Or lo l'shem baylim, whatever, Shinui kodesh, Shinui baylim. So we learned out where we know that from. Essentially, we learned it out from the juxtaposition of Korbin Pesach to Shlomim. Friends, that was the Zayin of Masechta Zevachim. Hope you enjoyed. Cheers.